Hello, I'm Juliette Foster and you're watching the European Magazine interview. Now in 2023, the European Commission brought a landmark case against Malta over the island's so-called golden passports. The case has far-reaching consequences not just for EU member states, but also for the global investment migration sector. What's at stake is the right of an EU country to determine who is entitled to be one of its nationals and, by extension, who is a citizen of the European Union. In other words, should that decision be the exclusive and sovereign right of individual member states, as provided by the Treaty on European Union, or should it be the EU that decides? Well, big questions like these require the help of an expert, and I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Kaelin, chairman of Henley Partners and one of the world's leading experts on citizenship by investment. Dr. Kaelin has played a pioneering role in building the foundations of the modern investment migration industry, which is why he's also nicknamed Mr. Citizenship. Well, Christian, it's very good to see you. I'm not going to call you Mr. Citizenship, but let's kick off with the focus on Malta's citizenship programme. Now, it does grant a certificate of naturalisation to those foreign individuals and their families who contribute to the island's economic development. But the European Commission claims the programme doesn't meet the so-called genuine link that's required for EU citizenship. So my question to you is, do you think that the Commission actually has a legal case? And what do you think it means when it refers to a genuine link requirement? What's your take on that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because I think most constitutional lawyers in Europe that follow the case ask themselves as well. And interesting also, this case went in a way already that is making it quite clear that the EU does not seem to have a case here at all, because there isn't such a thing as a genuine link requirement in EU law. It just doesn't exist. I think the EU tries here to encroach on member state sovereignty and competence when it doesn't have a legal basis for that.
That's something I do want to address, actually, this idea of encroachment. But let's broaden things out a bit, because look, isn't the European Union allowed to at least regulate the citizenship of that union? And given that reality, doesn't it therefore have the right to influence the domestic citizenship policies of member states? After all, you're a club has rules.
Yeah, but exactly, this club, the rule says that the competence for regulating citizenship remains with the member states and not with the European Union. There are very clear rules in this club indeed, and one of the most clear rules is indeed the competence with regards to citizenship matters, which is the exclusive domain of member states. And this is what this case is about. So the EU tries to operate here in an area where it doesn't have competence, which, as a lawyer, to me, it's quite astounding.
I mean, the Commission, from its perspective, it claims that Malta is violating the principle of sincere cooperation and at the same time compromising the Union's citizenship rules by granting it to individuals who don't have that genuine link or a meaningful connection to the country. So surely there's some validity in that position.
Look, I think what is happening is that some people, including in the Commission, but more in the European Parliament and more in some political circles, believe, citizenship in the EU should just not be made available for investments or for money, which is not fully the case actually here in Malta. But of course, one could argue that way, that it is some kind of a program where for money you obtain in the end citizenship. There's a lot of due diligence, a lot of links actually to the country that you need to establish, and background checks and longer period of time of residence, etc. But let's say this citizenship for money, and that is something that is quite rightly a question for, let's say, a political debate. You can take a very good position and say this is actually quite a legitimate way to citizenship, and you can also take a position that it may be not. I think it is obviously a good way to obtain citizenship, and it's actually a very well established way going back 2,000 years to the origins of modern citizenship established by the Romans. So it's nothing new. But at the moment, I think this is the overall point that people think, well, no, this shouldn't be the case. A different story is, however, what is legally possible or not in the EU. And it's completely clear that the path to citizenship is a path on the individual member state level, and that the member states are in charge to actually decide who are their citizens and not Brussels. And now Brussels is trying to find a way to encroach on member states' right to determine who are their citizens, which is quite outrageous, actually.
I mean, it does actually bleed into this question which I was going to put to you, because it's what it illustrates. In other words, the growing tensions between national sovereignty on the one hand and then progressive European integration. But also it's the fact that Malta is at the centre of this, and it's the EU's smallest member state. So the vibe I'm getting off you is that you are actually very sympathetic to critics who say, look, this is another example of the EU appropriating areas that perhaps member states are competent enough to actually handle by themselves. It's lines of authority where you can go and where you should basically back off.
Yeah, well, actually, in the EU, it should be quite clear, because the EU operates on a conferral of powers principle, that essentially it only has those powers, obviously, that the member states give to the EU. Now, whenever the EU tries to go beyond what has been given by the treaties of the EU, it's becoming obviously problematic, because it is, in a way, an illegal enlargement of the powers of the EU. I think it is actually precisely this this kind of illegal expansion of power, when it is opportune, when there is an opportunity, like here with Malta, it's an obvious opportunity for the EU to try with the smallest member states to encroach in an area that they actually clearly do not have competence. And the Advocate General Collins, in his opinion that came out very recently as part of this court case, made that very clear. And that's actually the opinion of more or less most EU lawyers. I don't think any EU lawyer can say the EU has competence on that. But I think what people try to say is, yeah, but the EU can maybe, under this very broad provision of sincere cooperation, can maybe find a way to, because we just do not like Malta selling passports. But that's a political discussion and shouldn't be a legal one. And exactly the EU using legal methods here within the legal procedures within the EU framework to try to coerce small member states. It's usually against smaller member states.
But I mean, let me take you to something which you're on the record as saying, and it gives us a sort of another side to this as well. But you're quoted as saying that citizenship and residence rights are part of a nation's equity, which it in turn can use to leverage gains which are beneficial to its citizens. So in the last decade where you are in Malta, how do you think that Malta and indeed other EU member states have actually benefited from leveraging that so that they can actually help their citizens with these investment migration programs? Because really, what you appear to be saying is that this is a tremendous asset, and you use an asset like a house to borrow money, so why not use the asset of citizenship to actually attract money?
Yeah, of course, that is exactly what's happening. And the interesting part is also that if, for instance, Malta or another country in the EU gives a golden visa, or in this case, like Malta, even citizenship, it gives it to highly qualified, very desirable individuals and families that then may very well not go on and live in Malta, but they might end up living in Germany or France or visiting Spain or whatever. In any case, it benefits the whole of the EU. And the point of critique, exactly, that there's not enough links to Malta, and then they will maybe go to Paris and spend money there, or go to business meetings in Frankfurt. It's an absurd argument, because it's actually exactly in the interest of the EU. And besides that, the EU has actually defined in its own regulations what an ideal EU citizen looks like in terms of the background, including financial independence and so on, to avail him or herself of the free movement. And every single person naturalized in Malta fulfills the requirement of what an ideal EU citizen is. So here we have Malta creating a few hundred new very good EU citizens. And on the other hand, you have the EU letting in hundreds of thousands of illegal migrants, unstructured, that lead to a lot of political and other actually legal problems. And at the same time, the EU also gives thousands and thousands of visas and also citizenships, millions actually, to people that are probably much less qualified than the few hundred that Malta gives. So the entire discussion is rather absurd, actually, if you look at the facts.
Let me close out, Christian, by putting a hypothetical situation to you, because if the Commission does succeed in restricting Malta's citizenship policy, are you worried that it could potentially set a dangerous precedent that potentially weakens national sovereignty across the EU?
First of all, I do not think the EU has any legal case at all. And so far, this case has also gone in that direction. And I would always say, if there is rule of law in Europe, then the EU Commission must lose this case. But then it's also quite political. And sometimes the European Court of Justice is taking quite political decisions. And so I can imagine some kind of wishy-washy decision that doesn't make the EU lose completely its face. I think it wouldn't be right, because as a lawyer, I think in particular in Europe, the rule of law is actually at risk. And that's what the EU itself points out all the time to weaker member states, including, interestingly, Malta and some others. Rule of law is very important. Yeah, we completely agree with that, actually. In particular in Europe, the rule of law is in decline, especially after Brexit. I always of the opinion that with Brexit, the biggest loser is actually the EU, and mainly in terms of having lost a large, very stable, in terms of rule of law, leading country. And so the rest of Europe, it's more problematic. It's not all Northern European or German court systems. So I think we're going to see very clearly with this decision whether there is rule of law in Europe or not. And I very much hope it will be.
Okay, there we're going to have to leave it, because sadly we have run out of time. But Dr. Christian Kaelin, Chairman of Henley Partners, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. You're watching the European Magazine interview.